All right, welcome back to the JFK Assassination Audit. And like I said, we're going to switch back and forth between the assassination timeline and then Oswald's past timeline. But right now, I'm stuck on Mexico City, so we will keep doing that. It is video number 65, 23 February. I'm going to call this one Checkmate, Bishop to Knight. So we're up to the 23rd of September 1963. Chief of Cuban Operations David Atlee Phillips, also known as Maurice Bishop, was made the CIA's Chief of Cuban Operations at that time, and Phillips worked under the diplomatic cover of the U.S. State Department Embassy in Mexico City. And we went over his Wikipedia. Now we're going to get into his Spartacus article here. So it says David Atlee Phillips was born in Fort Worth, Texas on 31 October 1922. So in 1963, he would have been 41. He'd be a seasoned, very experienced CIA agent. He was educated at William and Mary College and Texas Christian University. During the Second World War, he served as a nose gunner in the United States Air Force. He was also shot down, according to the Wikipedia article, and but managed to escape. Now, it's interesting that he's from Fort Worth, and also that's where Oswald ends up. Marie Oswald ends up in Fort Worth. Matter of fact, Oswald is buried in Fort Worth. It says Phillips joined the Central Intelligence Agency in 1950. So let's take a look here, a little calculator. 1950 minus 1922. He would have been 28. Over the next few years, Phillips was involved in clandestine operations in Guatemala against President Jacobo Arbenz. The plot against Arbenz became part of the executive action, a plan to remove unfriendly foreign leaders from power. Tracy Barnes was placed in charge of what became known as Operation Success. Phillips was appointed to run propaganda against the Arbenz government. According to the Phillips, he initially questioned the right of the CIA to interfere in Guatemala. In his autobiography, Phillips claims he said to Barnes, "But Arbenz became president in a free election. What right do we have to help someone topple his government and throw him out of office?" However, Barnes convinced him that it was of vital importance that the Soviets did not establish a beachhead in Central America. So this is one thing we're going to see that comes up in the CIA. That the CIA is just not a information gathering intelligence agency like the rest of the agencies in the world, the majority. It's actually a covert clandestine action agency, whether affecting elections, installing or uninstalling leaders of foreign countries, whether they're communist or not. What we find out is that in the beginning, at least, of the CIA, it was influenced heavily by big oil, by the Ivy League establishment. I'm talking like graduates of Yale and Harvard, and by other big industries like the banana and the coffee industry that basically ruled South America or was given a free hand in South America. And any government, no matter how pro-communist or anti-communist they were, that didn't go along with no unions for coffee and banana workers, and basically giving those companies a free hand like United Fruit, they were against. And the CIA was basically infiltrated or established from the very beginning with people that sided with companies like Hunt Oil and these coffee and banana owners and stuff like that. So what you can see is, like, I use the example of Hydra, and Hydra has infiltrated SHIELD, okay, but people inside of SHIELD don't know there are members of Hydra inside controlling and using the establishment of SHIELD and their infrastructure and their buildings and their manpower to establish its goals of doing what it wants. And like Hydra, a lot of these groups existed before the CIA, and the CIA, once the CIA was created, these groups infiltrated or inserted their people into it, and it was the majority of the CIA employees in the beginning. A lot of these people were Southern, like from Virginia, mainly from Texas, but you had a lot of Ivy League people also. And so this is what we have with the establishment with Maurice Bishop, and then you see all these other Southerners involved in this entire establishment also. All right, so it says CIA propaganda campaign included the distribution of 100,000 copies of pamphlet entitled Chronology of Communism in Guatemala. They also produced 3 films on Guatemala for showing free in cinemas. Phillips, along with E. Howard Hunt, was responsible for running the CIA Voice of Liberation radio station. Faked photographs were distributed claimed to show the mutilated bodies of opponents of Arbenz. William Rip Robertson was also involved in the campaign against Jacobo Arbenz. Now see, the same thing that happens to Arbenz is the same thing that happens to Allende in Chile. You've got these groups. Essentially, what we have, most of these revolutions in South America are people revolutions. They're the establishment of the majority of the people against the ruling elite. Now, this ruling elite in all these countries in South America always goes back to the established Spanish rulers that were ruling the country for hundreds of years before the 1900s. Okay, so what happened is that you had the Spanish, they came in, they controlled the country. Okay, you got Hernando Cortez, you got Pizarro, and so these very, very small minority of the population were the Spanish militaristic elite. They intermarried with the elite of the Incas, the Aztecs, and the Maya, and produced the mestizos. Okay? The mestizos were sort of the dependents of the Spanish ruling elite. And in South America, a lot of the rulers were able to proudly, talk about how pure their bloodline was of Spanish heritage, and how they weren't like the common people, the poor, which are usually, the Native Americans, the native of that area, the Incas, the Mayas, the Aztecs. And so when the Spanish were kicked out of South America, the Spanish administration was gone, but there's a long tradition of a couple hundred years of this mestizo and Spanish descendant elite ruling these countries. Okay? And that continued all the way up into the 1900s, even today. Okay? And so what we found is that a lot of these so-called revolutions that the CIA would say were communist revolutions were just actually indigenous people's revolutions. Basically, the majority of the people were Native Americans, and they were fighting against this multi-layer of mestizo, the military, the mestizo ruling class, and then the Spanish ruling class above them. Okay, so that's what we have, and unfortunately, the CIA saw all revolutions, especially because a lot of these people, that the only people who would give them help were the Soviets and the Cubans, and they were doing it for their own ends. So a lot of times the CIA saw these revolutionaries as just pure Marxists. And some of them were. Some have been trained in Cuba, some have been trained in Moscow, but not all of them were. What we found is the revolutions that were going on in places like Guatemala and places like El Salvador were mostly peasant revolutions against the ruling elite. The peasants didn't own any of the land, they didn't have any power, and so what happens is that the Marxists and the communist revolutionaries started to meld their message with this peasant revolution until it almost became one, and then they were much more aggressive and were able to take over the reins of the peasant revolutions. Okay, so again, what you have is the CIA is not making any distinction between the communist, Marxist, and the peasant revolutions. And usually what happened is that a lot of times the Marxists in Central America, the communists, would ride along with a popular revolution against the government. And then once they'd let the populists, they'd let the people's revolutions fight the war for them and wear each other out between the government. And then once the people ousted the dictator and they got into power, then there'd be a counter coup. This is a classic communist revolutionary tactic. Once they got into power, then they would take over, have a counter coup against the people's revolution, and then we saw it turned into a communist revolution like they did in South America, and also this is what happened in Cuba. But a lot of times the CIA was not able to make the distinction, and you saw that's how the Americans and the CIA supported Castro in the beginning, because he was riding this populist revolution. But then once they got into power, then he turned on the civilian leaders, the civilians who were in this revolution, and made it a communist revolution. Anyway, so we'll keep going here. It says, so this is what's going on with Arbenz. He's got a popular revolution. Same thing with Allende. It's a popular revolution. Unfortunately, there's a lot of communists and Marxists in that organization. And this is what the CIA was afraid of. The CIA began providing financial and logistical support for Colonel Carlos Castillo with the help of resident Anastasio Somoza, who actually became the dictator of Nicaragua. Castillo had formed a rebel army in Nicaragua. It's been estimated that between January and June of 1954, the CIA spent over $20 million on Castillo's army. This is exactly what happened with the Contras. Once they were kicked out in the Popular Revolution, the Sandinistas took over and revealed that they're communists. Then you had the military leaders, ex-National Guard leaders hold up in Honduras and in Costa Rica, and then they started getting funded by the CIA, and then all those funds were cut off, and then that's where you get into the problems with the Contras. Basically they were selling arms. The Americans were selling arms to the Israelis to the Iranians, okay, and then they were taking missiles that were worth $10 million, selling for $30 million. They were taking that money, replacing the stock, and then using that money for their own private interests, but also to send to the Contras, to privately fund the Contras. And that's exactly what happened. This is almost the exact same thing that happens in Guatemala. On 18 June 1954, aircraft dropped leaflets over Guatemala demanding that Arbenz resign immediately, or else the country would be bombed. Now, the one thing you got to ask yourself is, where are these rebels getting bombers if they're not getting them from the CIA or the Americans? So the CIA's Voice of Liberation also put out similar broadcasts. This was followed by a week of bombing ports, ammunition dumps, military barracks, and the international airports. Now, unfortunately, okay, even though the CIA supposedly supports the freedom-loving revolutionaries, anti-communist revolutionaries, most of the time it's basically to support either the oil industry, the coffee, or the banana industry. And everybody knows what happens after that, that the workers' rights are suppressed, the land's taken away from them, and then there's a brutal dictator who's allowed to do what he wants as long as he professes to be anti-communist. Carlos Castillo, a collection of soldiers, now crossed the Honduran-Guatemalan border. His army was outnumbered by the Guatemalan army. However, the CIA Voice of Liberation successfully convinced Arbenz supporters that two large and heavily armed columns of invaders were moving towards Guatemala City. One CIA memo by Raymond Letty said it may be necessary to take more deadly plans might need to develop. The best way to bring about the fall of Arbenz government would be to eliminate 15 to 20 of its leaders within Trujillo's trained pistoleros. Basically assassinate them. The CIA also was busy bribing Arbenz military commanders. It was later discovered that one of the commanders accepted $60,000 to surrender his troops. Ernesto Guevara attempted to organize some civilian militias, but also senior army officers blocked the distribution of weapons. Jacoby Arbenz now believes he stood little chance of preventing Castillo's gaining power. Accepting the further resistance would only bring more deaths. He announced his resignation over the radio. Now you see, the CIA is using the same tactics it will use in almost every counter anti-communist revolution since Guatemala, all the way up to even Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq. Now in those cases there weren't communists, but it was the exact same formula. Okay? So you put out propaganda saying how bad the government is, and they may legitimately be bad. Okay? Then you find some military commander or somebody from that country to support and call them the freedom fighters. You arm them to the teeth, and then maybe even involve your own military, like we sent in special forces, Navy SEALs into Afghanistan. They brought lots of money and supported the opposition to the Taliban. We did the same thing when we went into Iraq. We sent in our own military because we couldn't convince anyone to switch. Only ones that switched was the Kurds, and so we used the Kurd areas as a base to invade into Iraq. It's the same exact formula. They're using, Honduras. They're using El Salvador, Nicaragua as a base to invade Guatemala. Did the same thing going into Nicaragua, and the same thing going into Chile. Castillo's new government was immediately recognized by the President Dwight Eisenhower. Castillo now reversed the Arbenz reforms. Mainly their agrarian reforms, giving the land back to the people. And of course that was the problem, is that a lot of this land they were trying to use they wanted to be used by the banana and coffee bean industry and not have any unions, be able to pay, subsistent wages and to control the land. It says he created the National Committee of Defense Against Communism and decreed the preventive penal law against communism to fight those who supported Arbenz when he was in power. Over the next few weeks, thousands were arrested on suspicion of communist activity. A large number of these prisoners were tortured or killed. So this is what you do, is you support someone, and they can be as brutal or even worse than a communist, but as long as they profess to be pro-American and give us free reign and anti-communist, most of the time we look the other way. David Atlee Phillips also worked undercover in Cuba in 1959 to 1960. He returned to the United States in 1960 and was involved in the organization of the Bay of Pigs operation. During this period, he worked with E. Howard Hunt in attempts to have Fidel Castro murdered. Phillips worked under Winston Scott, the head of the CIA station in Mexico. In April 1963, Scott wrote that his Phillips' comprehensive understanding of human beings combined with a thorough knowledge of covert action techniques and his fluent Spanish make him unusually valuable. He is most outstanding covert action officer that this rating officer has ever worked with. So there you go, there's Winston Scott. It says Winston Scott suggested to Richard Helms that Phillips should become his deputy station chief. However, Helms decided to appoint Phillips as chief of Cuban operations. Desmond Fitzgerald arrived in Mexico City to tell Phillips that he had the freedom to roam the entire Western Hemisphere, mounting secret operations to get rid of Fidel Castro. So, this is, again, Mexico City is a great place to be outside the purview of any kind of, I don't know what you say, any kind of watching by either JFK or RFK. You're in another country, you can do what you want. Phillips now worked closely with David Morales at JM Wave in Miami. Phillips also provided support to Alpha 66. It was later claimed that Phillips told Antonio Valenciana his goal was to provoke U.S. intervention into Cuba by putting Kennedy's back to the wall. So that's exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to provoke Kennedy into going into Cuba, to invading Cuba. They tried this in Bay of Pigs. They tried this in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And let's not forget Operation Northwoods, where the CIA had devised this plan to have a passenger airplane fly up, another fake passenger airplane fly up behind it. That passenger plane would land. The fake passenger plane would send out fake radio transmissions that were being hijacked by Cubans, and then it would be shot down or blown up, and then blamed on the Cubans and forcing Kennedy into invading Cuba. That didn't work, so that's when they turned on Kennedy and decided to eliminate him, and then put LBJ's back against the wall and force him into invading Cuba. By basically, this whole Mexico City operation is laying the groundwork of the assassination of Kennedy through Oswald at the feet of Cuba and Castro. This is what they're trying to do here. It says, Jefferson Morley argues in his book, Our Men in Mexico, that Phillips was running an anti-Castro covert operation out of the embassy in Mexico City. Morley speculates that his field man was George Joanides. We all know who that is. We'll get into him later. On the 25th of November, Gilberto Alvarado, a 23-year-old Nicaraguan man, contacted the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City and said that he had some important information about Lee Harvey Oswald. The U.S. Ambassador Thomas McMahon passed the information on to Winston Scott, and the following morning, Scott's deputy Alan White and another CIA officer interviewed Alvarado. He also claimed that during a visit to the Cuban embassy, he overheard a man he now recognized as Oswald talking to a red-haired Negro man. According to Alvarado, Oswald said something about being man enough to kill someone. He also claimed he saw money exchanging hands. He reported the information at the time to the U.S. Embassy, but they replied, "Quit wasting our time. We were working here, not playing." So again, that's just another false flag to lay the groundwork of the assassination of Kennedy through Oswald at the hands of the Cubans and Castro. Okay? Again, you have to really question that, because, first of all, if you've got a handler at the Cuban embassy, he's not going to be sitting out in front talking with Oswald about killing Castro or about killing JFK and handing him money out in public like that for every dumbass to see. So highly, highly doubt that actually happened. But again, you can see, okay, this all has to do with, tainting the well, I guess you could say, of Lee Harvey Oswald, okay, and again, painting him as this assassin before the fact. This is another indication of the extent to which the plot would go, to basically frame Oswald. It says Thomas C. Mann and Phillips believe Alvarado, but Scott was not so sure. He argued there was an outside possibility that it might be a setup by the right-wing government of Nicaragua, who wanted the United States to invade Cuba. However, as Jefferson Morley pointed out in Our Man in Mexico, the unstated message emanating from the White House was now clear to Wynne, though not to men. Speculation about Oswald's motives was to be cut off, not pursued. All right. So that's Maurice Bishop. We're going to keep going through these documents that we have on Maurice Bishop. But first, we'll do some more video. All right, again, so this is Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City. Mexico Explained. Very, very good video here. And this is a good little podcast. We'll get into it.
Second, by reading the transcript of this call, it seems like the people who are doing the talking are fishing for information and are not really sure of the sequence of events that had already happened. Third, the person identified as Oswald spoke broken, almost incomprehensible Russian. Oswald was a fluent speaker of that language. The fourth strange aspect of the call is that there was no need for it to have been made in the first place. If Oswald left the Soviet consulate that morning and had resigned himself to the fact that getting a quick visa was hopeless, why would there be any need for a follow-up telephone call? The House Select Committee theorized that this Oswald may have been an imposter. It was not uncommon for the CIA station itself or other intelligence agencies to impersonate people successfully for whatever ends. This voice imposter would make perfect sense. On Tuesday, October 1st, the day before Oswald left Mexico, 2 more calls came into the Soviet consulate, one made at 10:31 and the other at 10:45. The people transcribing the calls noted that it was the same person who was on the Saturday morning call to the Soviets. The man on the line identified himself as Oswald by name. He spoke poor Russian and was checking on the status of his visa. Again, this makes no sense because there was no visa to check and the speaker's Russian was bad. There can be very little doubt that the person who made the 2 calls on Tuesday and the one on Saturday was some sort of voice double for Oswald. The story does not end here, and nor does it.
So again, you have to ask yourself, okay, if Oswald's just this nut, and it's just him alone trying to get into Cuba, to get into Russia, to come back to the United States to kill the president, and he's already resigned himself. Again, you have to think about these things logically, okay? So, and it's easy to look back on things after the fact and say, oh, well, yeah, of course. But see, at the time, no one knew exactly what was going on. But this is even more indication that Oswald was being set up as the patsy for an assassination that he didn't know was coming, because he's busy trying to get into Russia through Cuba, okay? So it doesn't make any sense that the things that are going on in Mexico City. It's only later when you look back you realize that Oswald was being set up. There's someone who's imitating his voice. That means they know that he's there. They know what his mission is, and they know what he's up to, okay? And they're shadowing him. Anyway, we'll keep going.
Get any less complicated. After Lee Harvey Oswald left the Soviet diplomatic compound on Saturday morning, we have a few days, the rest of Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, that are not properly accounted for. In the original Warren Commission report, there is next to nothing about what he was doing on these missing days. It was after the commission published its findings that rumors began to circulate about Oswald's whereabouts in Mexico from September 28th to October 3rd, 1963. The 2 big rumors that ended up being investigated by the House Select Committee in the late 1970s had to do with Oswald's involvement with a leftist student group and Oswald being spotted at a party in a private home. The House Committee eventually tracked down a man named Oscar Contreras, who was part of a pro-Castro student group at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM. Sylvia Duran from the Cuban consulate allegedly told Oswald that getting a solid recommendation from a pro-Cuban source might expedite his visa paperwork, and so this was the reason why he made the university visit. Contreras and other Mexican students interacted with Oswald at a lecture at UNAM's School of Philosophy. Besides Contreras, no other students from the group were ever identified or found. No photographs or other physical proof that Oswald was at the university have ever surfaced. In the course of an investigation undertaken by Jim Garrison, the district attorney from New Orleans, Contreras was interviewed and provided vague details of his interaction with Oswald. Contreras never spoke to the House committee. Another rumor that Oswald had been spotted at a party either Monday or Tuesday night comes from a very interesting source, the wife of Mexican poet and diplomat Octavio Paz. This woman, a poet in her own right, was Elena Garro. Garro was at this party, which was being held at the home of Ruben Duran Navarro, the brother-in-law of Sylvia Duran, the Mexican employee at the Cuban consulate. Ruben was Elena's cousin. Garro claimed that she saw Oswald at the party with two other young, quote, beatnik-looking, unquote, American men. No one at the party spoke to the three Americans, and after the assassination, the Durans stated that Oswald was never at any of their parties. Elena Garro claimed to see Oswald and the other two Americans the next day on Avenida de los Insurgentes, one of the main boulevards of the Mexican capital. No photographs of the party exist, and there are no other witnesses to Oswald at the party. The House Select Committee on Assassinations tried to get a statement from Elena Garro in the late 1970s but could not. Garro was also responsible in part for perpetuating another rumor that Sylvia Duran, the Mexican employee at the Cuban consulate who supposedly helped Oswald with his visa issues, was having an intimate relationship with Oswald while he was in Mexico. This allegation deserves further investigation.
Again, now you have to think about what is the purpose of that story. Okay? So, do I believe that Oswald was at a party of Sylvia Duran, the Mexican national who worked at the Cuban embassy? No. Do I believe that Oswald was having an intimate relationship with Sylvia Duran from the Mexican national from the working at the Cuban embassy? No. Do I believe that someone was imitating Oswald at a party of Sylvia Duran, a Mexican national working at the Cuban embassy? Most likely not. I'd say about 75-80% sure no. So then you have to ask, what is the purpose of this story? Well, it's obvious when you look at it that it's to imply that Oswald had an intimate relationship with the Cubans through Duran, whether he was having sex with her or not, okay? And that Oswald knew Duran prior to coming down there, and therefore he's at one of her parties. Now, the question you have to ask yourself, and the logic is, if all that was possible and all that was going on, do you really think that Oswald would have been frustrated and desperate and running back and forth like a chicken with his head cut off between the Russian and the Cuban embassy trying to get this damn visa? And Duran would have helped him then, right? If he already knew Duran, going to her party, having intimate relationships with her, she would have expressed his visa. He wouldn't have had a problem with it. So what they're trying to do, this is a false story planted by the CIA to say that Oswald has an intimate relationship already with the Cubans, therefore the Russians, therefore when the Oswald is framed for the assassination, it links back to the Cubans and the Russians. This is another part of that story about the money. That Oswald is supposedly seen getting money, at the Cuban embassy by this Negro officer, and then he's got a intimate relationship with Sylvia Duran. And then, but the question you have to ask yourself, well, if all that's going on, Oswald really doesn't even need to go to Mexico City, because if he's already working with the Cubans, they're going to just issue him a visa from Mexico City and have a courier bring it to him while he's in Mexico City, or just send it to him in New Orleans. That's how it would work. But again, none of this is real. It's all false information to lay the groundwork or the planning of the assassination at the feet of Castro and the Cubans. Now, I'm not a fan of Castro. I'm not a fan of the Cuba and its communist dictatorship. But the facts are the facts, and the reality is reality. And when you look at all these things, you can see exactly what's going on. They sent Oswald on a mission to shake things up. They told him some kind of cover story. He thinks he's doing his mission. He doesn't know he's being set up and painted as a crazy communist that ends up shooting the president 2 months later. And again, you have to ask yourself the logic, okay? If he got this kind of relationship with the Cubans already, what's the point of going to Mexico City? Why is he getting frustrated? Why is he going like a chicken back and forth between the Cuban and the Russian embassies, frustrating to get this visa and doesn't succeed? If he has this intimate, close relationship with Duran and the Cuban embassy already, it wouldn't have been a problem. If he had really been a communist, he would have been notified. The Communist Party in America would have notified the Cuban embassy. They would have taken care of his visa, no problem. But even Duran says that it was kind of odd that he was trying to, say that he was involved with the communists, but this was the odd way to go about getting a Cuban visa. It wasn't done the normal procedure. So what you see, like I said, is they're painting Oswald, falsely with this false propaganda, just like they did with Arbenz, just like they did with all these other leaders we've overthrown. Before the actual event, they're planting false stories about Arbenz torturing people. They're even torturing people and killing them and leaving them and blaming that on Arbenz. The same thing with Oswald. It's the same situation. They're, falsely painting Oswald as this nut, this crazy Marxist, trying to get into Cuba, to get into Russia, to go back to Russia. But, of course, that story doesn't jive with, if he's trying to get into Cuba to go back to Russia, then how's he going to end up killing the president two months later? See, it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, we'll keep going.
The mid-1960s, when rumors initiated or perpetuated by Elena Garro began to swirl around Mexico City,
we're going to get into Garro later,
was already being discredited from being a reliable source for information. She didn't like the Cubans, and she didn't like her cousin's sister-in-law Sylvia Duran. After the assassination of Kennedy, Elena Garro had her own personal reasons for connecting the alleged assassin to Duran and the Cubans. CIA Station Chief Winston Scott was aware of Elena Garro's allegations and dismissed her as being, quote, nuts, end quote. A very interesting figure connected to Lee Harvey Oswald's time in Mexico City, and who keeps popping up in the research, was Sylvia Duran, the attractive 26-year-old Mexican employee at the Cuban consulate who helped Oswald initially, and was accused by the rumor mill of having an affair with him. Perhaps Sylvia was an easy target to victimize, because it was well known around the diplomatic circles in Mexico City that a few years before she had had an affair with the then Cuban ambassador to Mexico. At some point after the Kennedy assassination, Sylvia Duran was picked up for questioning by the Mexican police and possibly tortured. While the full contents of the Duran interrogation were not made available to the Americans, it was made public that Duran confessed to having intimate relations with Oswald. This piece of information was also reported in the Mexican newspapers. The House Select Committee on Assassination.
See, again, it's just another way of falsely connecting Oswald to the Cubans and thus the Russians, okay? Again, you got to think, Mr. Smooth, who couldn't even please his own wife, is somehow able in, a few days to bed this counsel, this lady, in Mexico City, okay? Just very strange story. Again, it's just another way of, he slept with Duran, so maybe Duran convinced him to kill the president. 2 months later, while she was trying to help him get his visa to get into Cuba, to get into Russia. Again, if you think about it, you sit back and think about it logically, it doesn't make any sense. This is why I think Winston Scott is figuring out that something is going on that doesn't make any sense.
Assassinations could not verify the veracity of Duran's testimony, and in its final report speculated that Sylvia Duran could have been a penetration agent placed in the Cuban embassy either by the American CIA or by the Mexicans. Hence, the reason why the Mexicans apprehended her and coerced a statement out of her.
And again, you got to think about that also. If she's a penetration agent, okay, it would serve her legend that she's on the Cuban side to give her a false, I was tortured by the Mexican police. That would make her more sympathetic. That would make the Cubans more sympathetic to her and put their guard down that she's a penetration agent. So that's a perfect legend-building story to put out there in the Mexican newspaper. Okay, do you really think that the Mexican police, if they tortured someone, would allow that to get out and be put into the Mexican press? Oh yeah, we're torturing people. That story was planted to build Sylvia Duran's legend, because most likely she was a penetration agent that was monitoring the Cubans for the Mexican government and thus the CIA.
Sylvia Duran's role in all of this could be pivotal, especially in light of the great doubt that later researchers have placed on the possibility that the real Lee Harvey Oswald was never even in Mexico. Researchers who allege that the real Lee Harvey Oswald was never in Mexico City cite several anomalous pieces of information to strengthen their case. As previously mentioned, the House Select Committee believed that 3 calls allegedly made by Oswald were fake, including the last call from the Cuban consulate to the Soviet consulate, which supposedly involves Sylvia Duran. The man calling himself Oswald spoke incomprehensible Russian, while the real Oswald was fluent in that language. But what do we know of the other visits and calls? What tangible proof exists that Oswald was really there? It was well known that the Cuban and Soviet embassies in Mexico City were under heavy scrutiny. The CIA, as well as intelligence agencies from other governments, closely monitored the comings and goings of the people there. In all the photographs that were taken during the highly scrutinized time of Oswald's visit, not a single photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald has surfaced, even after 2 government investigations. During a trip taken to Havana, Cuba to investigate this case, investigators of the House Select Committee on Assassinations met with Castro representatives who shared their own surveillance materials from the Cuban embassy and consulate from late September and early October of 1963. The Cubans had books of photographs taken outside their own diplomatic compound, and those photos showed everyone coming and going. Oswald was not to be seen among the pictures. In addition to this lack of photographic evidence, we also have conflicting statements made by eyewitnesses who were in the presence of the man claiming to be Oswald at the Cuban consulate. These witnesses reported that he was blond, muscular, and almost 30 years old. The real Oswald was 24, skinny, and no more than 5'6". Wiretapping and recording device evidence of Oswald's time in Mexico City is also non-existent. Either tapes were erased, misfiled, or destroyed. All we have left are transcripts. Speaking of transcripts, a curious transcript of a phone conversation between President Lyndon Johnson and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was uncovered by intrepid JFK assassination researchers. It starts with President Johnson asking, quote, "Have you established any more about the Oswald visit to the Soviet embassy in Mexico in September?" End quote. The FBI director replies, quote, "No, that's one angle that's very confusing for this reason. We have up here the tape and the photograph of the man who was at the Soviet embassy using Oswald's name. The picture and the tape do not correspond to the man's voice, nor to his appearance. In other words, it appears that there is a second person who was at the Soviet embassy." End quote. So, was Oswald even in Mexico? Some researchers believe that the real Oswald had information about plots to kill Cuban President Fidel Castro, and that he was really working for the CIA. Castro stated publicly that he felt like he was being set up to take the fall for the Kennedy assassination. Did some sort of blame the Cubans plot get thwarted and Oswald was sacrificed? Could missing photos and conflicting reports of various Oswalds in Mexico City be part of what Dan Hardaway from the Select Committee said about conspiracies? Has all of this been part of the red herrings, false trails, and disinformation that Hardaway was talking about? There are many JFK-related documents that still have not been released to the public, but even after their release, we may never know the full story of Lee Harvey Oswald's 5 days in Mexico. Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Mexico Unexplained. Remember to like and subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on Twitter. Please go to our website, MexicoUnexplained.com, for references, illustrations, and for free access to transcripts of past shows.
All right, there you go. Again, that's an excellent summary of Oswald's trip to Mexico City through Mexico Unexplained. So let's just summarize what we got from that and from other information real quick, and then we'll go into more of Maurice Bishop tomorrow. So we've got this Godot guy showing up ahead of Oswald at the Mexican consulate in New Orleans and getting the visa right before Oswald. So it's like he's standing in line with Oswald. Hey, I'll take care of this. I'll get your visa and get this all worked out, because Oswald's an idiot. He doesn't know very much, okay? All he knows, he's being told and paid to do an assignment, go to Mexico City, send your wife off to Dallas, go to Mexico City, and then come back to Dallas. Now, I found some very interesting information. I'll go into this later when we get to closer to the dates, about a guy named John Howard Bowen, okay, who also went by the name, let me see, did I write that down? Of Albert Osborne, okay. Now, this guy, I'll go over this later, but basically to summarize it, he's a minister that travels around the U.S., goes back and forth into Mexico, supposedly sets up these churches, but he's about 83 years old in 1963, but he was spotted on the bus sitting next to Oswald as they left Laredo going to Mexico City. Okay, there's it's very interesting. I've been reading through all the FBI reports from the Warren Commission book. Okay, so it's not like they didn't know about this guy. Okay, and in there's witness after witness after witness that says this Albert Osborne, John Howard Bowen, was sitting next to Oswald that boarded on Laredo down to Mexico City. And when you dig in, even the FBI is finding interesting information about him. When you dig into it, you find out the guy was actually English. He was born in England, in Grimsley. Went to Canada right before World War One. Joined up, became a minister in the Canadian military. Fought in World War One. I guess he was stationed in Bermuda. Eventually ends up in the U.S. Not even a U.S. citizen, and he's somehow got like a farm or something in Knoxville, and he's got like a youth farm, a summer camp or something like that, and he has all these churches. Now again, when you think about people that can easily travel around, see things, and then come back to the United States and debrief about the things they've seen, okay, another good cover would be to be a minister. Another good cover would be a news reporter. Another good cover would be to be a geologist, an oil geologist, okay? So we've got this same group. Of course, Godot, he was traveling around Central America, South America, Mexico City with his news organization, and he was out of New Orleans. Then you've got Bowen, who's back and forth through New Orleans, back and forth through Knoxville, stays in Laredo. He goes by two different names, okay? I just find it very, very interesting about this guy. But he was sitting, according to witnesses, sitting right next to Oswald, okay, when they rode from Laredo into Mexico City, okay? So it's almost like he's a handler for Oswald, to get him to Mexico City, get him checked in, show him where things are at, and then let him go, okay? And then you've got Godot handling Oswald, helping get the visa, helping get to Laredo. But another interesting thing about Albert Osborne, we'll go over him later on this, is that on the day of the assassination, November 1963, okay, Albert Osborne, according to his brother and sister, who hadn't seen him in years, was back in Grimsley, okay, in the UK. And then on that exact same day, that morning, a call was received from Grimsley to the local newspaper, or maybe to the U.S. Embassy, I believe it's to a news organization, that says the president's going to be assassinated in Dallas today. And then the call hangs up. They were able to trace the call back to Grimsley, I think from a phone booth. But on that exact same day, this guy that's involved with Oswald, seen with Oswald, handling Oswald, all the way from Laredo to Mexico City, was in the UK in Grimsley, where a call was received before the assassination to a news organization telling them to watch out about the president being assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Maybe it's a fluke, maybe it's a lark, but I think that's just too many damn coincidences right there. Anyway, so going on here, we've got him handling Oswald. You've got Oswald showing up at the Cuban and the Russian consulates, trying to shake up things, trying to get this visa, even though, you know, they're using this trip to paint Oswald as being connected to the Cubans and the Russians, but they don't explain how if Oswald got his visa, if he was successful at getting his visa going to Cuba and getting to Russia, he wouldn't have been in Dallas to kill the president. So they don't explain that. Then there's these fake calls to the Cuban and Russian embassies that don't sound like Oswald, speaking in Spanish, and Oswald doesn't speak Spanish, speaking in broken Russian, and Oswald speaks perfect Russian. Then you've got this story from this Nicaraguan about him seeing Oswald in the Cuban embassy being passed money by a Negro and talking about killing the president, which I find unbelievable. Then you've got this Guardo story who says that she saw Oswald at a party of Sylvia Duran, who worked at the Cuban embassy. Okay. Which I don't find that story believable. Then you've got fake pictures of Oswald, supposedly, which doesn't even look like Oswald, but the CIA station says these are Oswald. This person was saying he was Oswald, according to their people inside the embassy. And then you got the story planted in the Mexican newspapers that Duran was interrogated and tortured by, the Mexican police and confessed to having an intimate relationship with Oswald, which I find that unbelievable. And then later on, we've got the story reported by FBI agent Hosty in Dallas in the interrogation room less than, an hour after Oswald has been caught at the Texas Theater, confronting Oswald about, you were in Mexico City, weren't you? What were you doing in Mexico City? And Oswald clamming up about that and getting upset. Which says to me that he's working as an informant and he's clamming up, not talking about it. He's talking about everything else, but Mexico City, Mrs. Payne's station wagon, he's clamming up about that. So that's a summary of Oswald in Mexico City and all those things that are just incredible, which tells you that Oswald, all these things don't happen by coincidence. They're all trying to lay the groundwork to frame Oswald for the assassination and lay the assassination plans at the foot of Castro and the Cubans in order to force LBJ to invade Cuba. Very, very clear. Anyway, so we're going to go into more stuff here. Hold on one second. All right, so we're back, and let's see here. So this is the Embassy of Nicaragua. Of course, you can see the location. You've got the Russian embassy here. The Temple Malur is right over here. And then you got the Cuban embassy here. This is part of that on the edge of those nice little hilly area there. All right, so let's take a little God's eye view of this embassy. All right, so you can see the embassy here, kind of a small building. Of course, Nicaragua is not a very large country. It's also communist. That means it's pretty damn poor. So I'm not sure if this is part of the embassy here, but you can see the building there. All right, so let's take a look, see if we have any pictures. It looks like there's 5 photos. Yeah, there's the embassy. Not a real expensive embassy. Yeah, there we go. And that's basically it. We're not going to have a lot of stuff to say about this one. All right. So this is the embassy here. That's the embassy compound. All right, so let's see. I'm not sure if that's part of the embassy compound, but that would make sense with that really high wall there. Well, yeah, just your basic security here. And no post, so they're not really worried. Again, if you think about it, Nicaragua doesn't have really a lot of enemies. So there's not going to be a lot of defense against like car bombs. But again, they've got kind of a reinforced kind of wall here, kind of a steel reinforced door. You can see they got the barbed wire. And they got their communications here, their electrical and telephone lines going out. But yeah, not a lot of security, but you got your basics. And again, like I said, Nicaragua doesn't have a lot of enemies. They are a pretty poor country right now, especially under the Marxists. But I'd still think the U.S. would want to monitor them. So let's take a look. So yeah, you got a nice little building here. Plenty of opportunities to put cameras in one of these nice little buildings here. Maybe even on top of that telephone pole. Alright, that's enough of that one. Hold on a second. Alright, so we're talking about Mexico City. I thought it'd probably do us some good if we got a little education on espionage, spying, and intelligence gathering, and how it relates to Oswald and how it relates to the Kennedy assassination. Alright, so it says espionage, spying, or intelligence gathering is the act of obtaining secret or confidential information, intelligence. A person who commits espionage is called an espionage agent or spy. An individual who's spy ring or a cooperating group of spies in a series of government, company, criminal organizations, or independent operation can commit espionage. The practice is clandestine and is a definition of unwelcome. In some circumstances, it may be legal tool of law enforcement. In other, it may be legal and punishable by law. So, basically, there's two types of intelligence, okay? There's open source, and then there's clandestine. So open source is like what I'm doing. Anything on the internet, anything in the libraries, anything in the news media, anything that's open to anyone, okay? Clandestine is going to be stuff that's top secret, confidential, that most normal individuals wouldn't have access to. And that's where most intelligence agencies gravitate, is to get that clandestine information either through sources inside the enemy or the target organization, or to tap lines, to tap computers, to tap phone lines, things like that, to get that information. It says espionage is often part of an institutional effort by a government or commercial concern. However, the term tends to be associated with state spying on potential or actual enemies of military organizations. Spying involves corporations and is known as industrial espionage. Now, companies do this all the time. I'd probably say that 50-60% of Chinese espionage in some way involves industrial or corporate espionage of some kind, stealing corporate secrets, stealing technology secrets to advance their own manufacturing base and stuff like that. It says one way to gather data and information about a target organization is by infiltrating its ranks. Spies can then return information such as the size and strength of enemy forces. They can also find dissidents within the organization and influence them to provide further information to detect. In times of crisis, spies steal technology and sabotage the enemy in various ways. Counterintelligence is the practice of thwarting enemy espionage and intelligence gathering. Almost all states have strict laws concerning espionage, including those who practice espionage in other countries, and the penalties of being caught are often severe. Alright, so it says the history of espionage. Espionage has been recognized as of importance in military affairs since the ancient times. The oldest known classified document was a report made by a spy disguised as a diplomatic envoy in the court of King Hammurabi, who died in around 1750 BC. The ancient Egyptians had developed a secret service, and espionage is mentioned in the Iliad, the Bible, the Amarna letters, as well as recordings of the story of the Old Testament, the 12 spies. Espionage was also prevalent in the Greco-Roman world when spies employed illiterate subjects in civil service. Now, the story of the 12 spies is pretty interesting. We'll get into that next. But basically, before the Israelites went from Egypt into the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan as it was called then, they sent in spies to kind of wander the countryside, go into towns, assess what the military situation was like, how the towns were fortified, and then they came back and reported back, and it actually scared the Israelites so much because the military fortifications of the Canaanites were so extreme. They also reported back that the Anakim, the Anakim were there, which were giants. The remainder of the giants that were left over, I guess, in the flood from the Bible is what it's saying, and that it scared the Israelites so much that they petitioned to Moses to take them back to Egypt because they didn't want to be killed by these giants, you know. So that actually pissed off God so much that he ends up cursing that generation of Israelites and makes Moses wander around the desert for 40 years until that generation died off and a new generation could come about. It says the thesis that espionage and intelligence has a central role in warfare as well as peace was first advanced in the art of war and in the Arthasastra. In the Middle Ages, European states excelled at what has later been termed as counter-subversion, when Catholic inquisitions were staged to annihilate heresy. Inquisitions were marked by central organized mass interrogations and detailed record-keeping. During the Renaissance, European states funded code breakers to obtain intelligence through frequency analysis. It says Western espionage changed fundamentally during the Renaissance when Italian city-states installed resident ambassadors in capital cities to collect intelligence. So what they're talking about is diplomatic intelligence. That's how we used to do intelligence, is through our diplomatic ambassadors, and then there would be a group of people part of that State Department embassy that would go out and gather intelligence in the country and about fortifications and other military things of importance. Renaissance Venice became so obsessed with espionage that the Council of Ten, which was normally responsible for security, did not even allow the Doge to consult government archives freely. In 1481, the Council of Ten barred all Venetian government officials from making contact with ambassadors or foreigners. Thus, revealing official secrets could face the death penalty. Venice became obsessed with espionage because successful international trade demanded that the city-state could protect its trade secrets. See, just like with China, almost exactly. Under Queen Elizabeth I of England, Francis Walsingham was appointed Foreign Secretary and Intelligence Chief. He's sort of like the pre-MI5. The novelist and journalist Daniel Defoe died 1731. Not only spied for the British government, also developed a theory of espionage, foreshadowing the modern police state methods. During the American Revolution, Nathan Hale and Benedict Arnold achieved their fame as spies, and was considerable use of spies on both sides during the American Civil War. Though not a spy himself, George Washington was an American spy master, utilizing espionage techniques against the British. So he had a group of spies that were going around gathering intelligence for him. It says, in the 20th century, the height of World War I, all great powers except the United States had elaborate civilian espionage systems, and all national military establishments had intelligence units. In order to protect the country against foreign agents, U.S. Congress passed the Espionage Act of 1917. Matahari, who obtained information for Germany by seducing French officials, was most noted espionage agent of World War I. Prior to World War II, Germany and Imperial Japan established elaborate espionage nets. In 1942, the Office of Strategic... Now, let's not forget, there was a Japanese national that was sent, I think there was actually two, that was sent to Hawaii that surveyed the ships that would come in and out of Pearl Harbor. And he would take pictures, make journals of different ships and how long they stayed in harbor, and then when they would leave and how many were in at one time, where they were stationed at. He made maps of the stations that the ships would pull up to, and then that intelligence was used with other intelligence that the Japanese had to make a mock model of the Pearl Harbor military situation, and the Japanese used that to practice bombing. So when the pilots flew over Hawaii, northern Hawaii, into the harbor, Pearl Harbor, they had a good idea of what the targets they were looking for. They already had an idea of the ships that were already there that they were looking for. This is another reason why the Americans passed that order that basically removed the Japanese from the West Coast and large parts of Hawaii. Let's see here. Prior to World War II, Germany and Imperial Japan established elaborate espionage nets. In 1942, the Office of Strategic Services was founded by General William J. Donovan. However, the British system was the keystone of American intelligence. Numerous resistance groups, such as the Austrian Meyer-Messner Group, the French Resistance, the Witt Brigade, Milorg, and the Polish Home Army, worked against Nazi Germany, provided the Allied Secret Service with information that was very important for the war effort. Now, let's not forget that it was the Polish resistance that actually found the German those cryptographic machines, and handed them over to the British for them to use to break down so they could read the German cables that were sent coded. Since World War II, the activity of espionage has enlarged, much of it growing out of the Cold War between the United States and the former USSR. The Russian Empire and successors, the Soviet Union, have a long tradition of espionage, ranging from the Okhrana, which was the Tsarist intelligence service, to the KGB, the Committee of State Security. Matter of fact, the beginning of the KGB was actually started by Okhrana members who had served the Tsar, and now they just turned their attention to serve their new masters, Lenin and the communists. All right, we've got about 2 more minutes here. It says, and the United States has 13 other intelligence gathering agencies. Most of the U.S. expenditures for intelligence gathering are budgeted to various defense departments, agencies, and their programs. Under the Intelligence Reorganization of 2004, the Director of National Intelligence is responsible for overseeing the coordinated activities and budgets of the U.S. intelligence agencies. In the Cold War, espionage cases included Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers and the Rosenberg case. In 1952, the Communist Chinese captured 2 CIA agents, and in 1960, Francis Gary Powers, flying a U-2 reconnaissance mission over the Soviet Union for the CIA, was shot down and captured. It says, during the Cold War, many Soviet intelligence officials defected to the West, including General Walter Krivitsky, Viktor Kravchenko, Vladimir Petrov, Peter Derabian, Pavel Manat, and Oleg Penkovsky of the GRU. Among Western officials who defected to the Soviet Union are Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean of Great Britain in 1951, Otto John West of West Germany, 1954, William H. Martin in Berlin, 2 U.S. cryptographers in 1960. Now, let's not forget that William Martin and Ben Mitchell actually traveled down to Mexico City, went to the Cuban embassy, okay, and then transited through Cuba, and then back up into the USSR. So the U.S. intelligence was well aware of this in 1963, and they were trying to emulate this through Oswald, going to Cuba and then back up into the Soviet Union. And then Harold Kim Philby of Great Britain, 1962, who was also associated with Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean. U.S. acknowledgement of its UT flights and exchange of Francis Gary Powers for Rudolph Abel in 1962 implied the legitimacy of some espionage as an arm of foreign policy. All right, so that's enough intelligence training there, but we're going over this because it's important, because it applies to Oswald and applies to what's going on in Mexico City. All right, take care.